This is the lecture for Monday, January 25th. This is the first lecture in the series in which we'll talk about attention. But before we can begin talking about attention, we need to define it and distinguish it from the idea of consciousness, which it's sometimes confused with. So attention is the means by which we process a limited amount of information from the wide variety of information that's available to us from our environment, our past experiences, and other cognitive processes. And attention includes both conscious and unconscious contents and processes as well. So you probably aren't aware of your feet at all times and how they feel until I said something just now. But you were processing that information unconsciously during that time. And if your feet had become uncomfortable, you probably then would have become aware of that and moved your feet to ease that discomfort. And so the fact that we attend to a small proportion of information that's available to us suggests that there are limits to our attention. So we selectively choose the things to attend to, both outside of us and within our physical and mental experiences as well. And so the idea that we attend to specific information means that we can then respond quickly and accurately to that. And in addition, we're more likely to remember information that we've focused our attention on. So in contrast, consciousness includes both the feeling of awareness and the contents of awareness. And so some of these feelings and these contents may be the focus of our attention. And so psychologists used to believe that consciousness and attention were the same thing, but now evidence suggests that there are some active attentional processes of our sensory experiences, as well as remembered information, stored information that just goes on without our conscious awareness. And so to move on from this, we'll then talk about these conscious attentional processes. And here we mean conscious in terms of the fact that we are both aware of it and also that there is a level of voluntary control over it. And so these conscious attentional processes are the most important aspects of this domain of attention. And they serve three purposes in our cognition. And so first of all, they help us monitor our interactions with the environment. And through this monitoring, we are able to maintain awareness of how well we're adapting to situations in which we find ourselves. And second, these conscious attentional processes assist us in linking the past in the form of memories to our present in the form of what we're currently experiencing sensation-wise. And so then this gives us a sense of continuity of experience that can then serve as the foundation for personal identity. So rather than there being this experience of you close your eyes and you went to sleep and you woke up and you have no idea, what came before you, where you are, anything like that. The fact that we have memories then allows us to keep adding to this experience that we call life, right? Where we're able to go, oh, okay, well, I went to bed last night and and these were the things that happened, yesterday. I went to class and then I talked to my roommate, and, and then I made lasagna for dinner. Um, and you're able to then connect to that, and have this sense of continuity, um, and especially within yourself and your sense of personal identity. The person that you were yesterday then continues to be the person that you are in the present. And third, these conscious, attentional processes, they help us in controlling and planning, for our future actions. So this forward thinking that we're able to do. And we're able to use the results of the monitoring of our environment that we do, and also, the continuity that we have between the past and the present, in order to do this sort of future planning. So then this third, conscious attentional process really then builds upon the others as well. And so they're all interacting, in this purpose, or in their respective purposes. And in addition to, this conscious, attention, there's also the idea of the pre-conscious. And so pre-conscious processing is information that is available to us that we can, act on cognitively, but it currently lies outside of our conscious awareness. So it's not something that you can just, pull up easily. And our pre-conscious knowledge also includes stored memories as well. So let's go on and talk about, some of the research that has been done on, consciousness. So one such concept, that has, been the focus of research on consciousness has been this idea of thought suppression. And thought suppression is this idea of, actively trying to keep from thinking about a particular thing, feeling, or topic. Um, and this actually, interestingly enough, kind of stemmed from, the author Leo Tolstoy's experience. One of his older brothers, bullied him by making him just stand in a corner and telling him not to think about a white bear. And if you've ever tried to not think about, a certain, event or feeling maybe that you are having, you know that it's pretty much impossible to do so. And so, a scientist by the name of Wagner, used the phrase ironic effects of mental control as a way to kind of describe how our efforts to suppress thoughts, can really backfire. And so when we try to, push away these certain thoughts, then ironically, it seems that those thoughts then are especially likely to creep back into our consciousness. There's really this, amplification then of those thoughts. And so Wagner, was actually inspired to, study, this anecdote from Tolstoy's childhood. Was really interested in, what came to be called the quote unquote white bear problem, and wanted to study this scientifically, wanted to try to find out what the basis was for, this kind of experience, this ironic, effect of mental control. And so, in one study that he carried out, there was one group of students who were told not to think of a white bear during a 5-minute period. So I'm sure that was a particularly long 5 minutes of trying not to think about a white bear. And then this group of students was then allowed to think about a white bear as much as they wanted during a second 5-minute period. So they went from 5 minutes of you're not allowed to think about a white bear to then 5 minutes of you can think about a white bear as much as you want. And so Wegner and, colleagues found that there was this sort of rebound effect. such that these students they were much more likely to think about a white bear during the second period following the 5 minutes of actively trying to suppress their thoughts about a white bear, in comparison to a control group who was also given 5 minutes to think about a white bear, but didn't have to engage in any thought suppression. And so this effect, it doesn't just occur when thinking about white bears. It's not just this sort of abstract hypothetical thing. It also occurs when people are instructed not to think about a painful stimulus or painful experience. They then become even more aware of the pain. And the same kind of effect occurs when, people try to concentrate, when you are trying not to move, when you're trying to fall asleep, right? I'm sure we've all had the experience of just lying there in bed and just telling yourself, fall asleep, fall asleep. All I want to do is fall asleep. And again, you've probably experienced that ironic or that paradoxical effect of all I want to do is fall asleep and that's all I can focus on. And yet it's not happening. And as you can then imagine too, in kind of the ways that we've talked a little bit about the real life implications of this topic is then highly relevant for clinical psychologists. So for example, suppose that you are a therapist and you're working with a client who has just severe depression. Well, if you encourage this client of yours, to stop thinking about depressing topics, ironically, this is more likely to have the effect of causing them to continue to think about depressing thoughts, probably increasing it even more, rather than your intended effect of trying to help them not. And so this issue and this paradox of thought suppression is also relevant for people with PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, psychosis, and these other sorts of psychological conditions. And one of these areas in which thought suppression has been studied is in OCD. And so Tolan and colleagues studied three groups of clients who were, well, there are three groups of clients. Sorry, let me back up. There were three groups of clients, and two of these three groups were seeking outpatient treatment for psychological disorders. And so people in one group had very high scores on a self-report measure of OCD, and those in the second group had another anxiety disorder, had another disorder that was not OCD. And then the third group was a control group, was just a collection of people from the general public who did not have any sort of psychiatric disorder. And so all of the participants were tested one at a time. And so during the first 5-minute period of testing, they were then told to just talk aloud about whatever came to mind, just sort of the stream of consciousness. And then during the second 5-minute period, similar to Wegner's experiment with the white bear, they were instructed to try not to think of a white bear. And then following this thought suppression period, they were given another 5 minutes where they could then think of anything that they wanted to. And so throughout all of these periods, they were asked to push a space bar on the computer whenever they thought about a white bear. So that's how they were logging the instances of thinking about white bears in this experiment. And so some of the most interesting results were the number of times that people in each group had pressed the space bar during the second period of 5 minutes, during the thought suppression period. And this is when they had been instructed not to think about a white bear. And so the people who had been diagnosed with OCD pressed the bar an average of about 20 times. And in contrast, the people in both the the control group and the group of people who have been diagnosed with anxiety, they pressed the bar an average of only 6 times. So we have 20 times versus 6 times on average. And so these results suggest that people who have OCD experience difficulty with inhibiting the obsessive thoughts that they often try to ignore. And so another area that is notable in the research in consciousness is the area of blind sight. And so blind sight describes a situation in which a person can perform a cognitive task really accurately with precision, but they have no conscious awareness that their performance is accurate. Specifically, blind sight refers to vision without awareness. So this kind of blind sight situation, it can occur when someone experiences damage to the visual cortex in the brain. And thus, as a result, this person's experience is that they cannot see. So again, sensory-wise, there hasn't been any damage to the eyes, the optic nerve, but it's at the point of the brain where the perception and the processing occurs that they're not the information is breaking down. And so despite this neurological deficit, there are some cases in which people with this kind of damage can report that there are some characteristics of the objects that have been presented to them that they are perceiving, such as location. And so for an example, a spot of light was flashed at a location that was 10 degrees to the right of the center of people's visual field. And people with blind sight were then asked to point to the light. And so typically the person would report, well, I didn't even see the light. Like, how would I know how to point to it? I can't see it. But when they were then encouraged to guess where the light was, people with blind sight performed at significantly better than chance levels. And in fact, their performance was actually almost perfect. So not only were they going above and beyond this sort of 50-50 chance of either getting it right or wrong, they tended to get it right, and they tended to get it right nearly every time. And other studies have shown that people with blind sight can report visual characteristics of stimuli, such as color or shape or motion. And so what's going on here? It's not that these people are making things up. They genuinely cannot see as they used to. And so presently, we think that although most of the information that's registered in the retina then travels to the visual cortex, some of the information also goes to other locations in the brain. And it's this information that goes to other locations that then allows the person with blind sight to, quote unquote, guess location, color, shape, and motion, relatively accurately. And so this blind sight research suggests that visual information has to pass through the primary visual cortex, again, located in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, to be registered into consciousness. So that's sort of where our conscious awareness of what we're seeing happens. And so the information that bypasses the visual cortex, it does not get registered into consciousness. And therefore, the person isn't aware of that information. And so we have this really interesting suggestion then of, again, going back to when I was talking about conscious attentional processes, it's also sort of pre-conscious. This information that is outside of our, voluntary quick declaration of like, yep, I saw the light, it's right there. But nonetheless, it is stored. And then finally, we have the topic of consciousness of complex mental processes. And so, um, no, no cognitive researcher believes that um, anyone has conscious access to these really simple, rudimentary sort of mental processes. So, for example, how we recognize whether a printed letter like an A is uppercase or lowercase. But there is some argument about whether we have access to more complex mental processes. And so researchers by the name of Erickson and Simon, they argued that people actually have pretty good access to their complex mental processes. And they used a technique called protocol analysis to understand or to try to understand how people solve problems in particular settings. They looked at chess and they also looked at cryptography, so like code breaking, like decoding like ciphers. And so essentially, what they had their participants do and what they saw their participants do is that they were able to talk about everything that they were thinking about while they were playing chess or trying to break a code. And their results then gave us some evidence of, yes, we are aware of our complex mental processes, and we're aware of them to a level of consciousness, right, where we're able to actually describe what's going on in our head, quote unquote. However, in contrast, some other researchers, Nisbet and Wilson, they had argued that actually our access to mental processes, it's not very good. So they said that they believe that, well, people think that they know how to solve complex problems, but their thinking is wrong. And these researchers would say that, well, we have good access to the products of our cognitive processing, so the end result, but not to the processes themselves. So we're able to make up a sort of a good story after the fact to make sense of this. And so an example of this kind of situation would be one where someone decides to buy a bike, and they then have to decide between, 3 different models, let's say. The person will certainly know which model of bike they actually ended up buying, but how that decision was made probably isn't truly accessible. But even so, the person can tell a good story about how he or she arrived at that decision. So you might ask somebody, well, why did you go with this model of bike? And they might say, well, as I was really thinking about it, I really decided that that this I didn't want to go above my budget, and so this was the one that was in my budget, and that's the one that I went with. But that's not the only factor that goes into making a decision, right? Like in this kind of example, there are a lot of other factors that surely the person was considering, the weight of the bike, the kind of bike that it was, would it fit their, needs? A bike for commuting to work is very different than a mountain bike. So they were likely thinking about, well, how best will this bike fit my needs? What kind of, components does it have? Do I think it'll last? Do I like the color, right? Do I like the look of the seat? All of these different factors that actually also played a fact in that decision making, but likely the person wasn't consciously aware of at that time. So again, this research then it brings up a lot of questions about what the various aspects of attention are, how attention happens, quote unquote. And so there are various places in our brain sort of information processing system where this process of attention is needed, is really critical. Um, and but a lot of these aspects of attention are actually related, or are intertwined to the idea of working memory. And so some of the questions that have tended to be asked about attention are, you know, what information is transferred from our sensory stores, from the sort of basic receptacle of sensory information that comes in right as it comes in, to our working memory. How does that then get transferred over? What information is accessed from our long-term memory? How much information can be processed at one time in working memory? Are there limits to that? How fast can we make a response? And these sorts of questions reflect an information processing approach to the issue of attention. And so originally, there were people who were interested in information theory, different from information processing, that information theory takes more of a mechanistic view. So information theory would be a lot more apt to think of the mind as a computer. And so out of this, there came some more mechanistically driven questions, such as where is the filter in the processing system? And so by filter, they mean this attentional filter, right? That's taking in all of this information that's constantly going around us and then filtering out, the sort of most important stimuli. Well, how could these attentional filters be tuned? Are there ways that we can change how selective or not that filter is? And what kind of channels, so to speak, what sort of input channels, so like vision, hearing, etc., are affected by these attentional filters, and how are they affected? And so the combination of both an information processing, which looks more at the level of cognitive function, and the information theory perspectives, which again kind of takes this more mechanistic approach. Both of these theories assume that there's a limitation to our processing capacity somewhere along the line in the system. And so we can't process an unlimited amount of information. And so a common metaphor that comes out of this is then to talk about this sort of bottleneck, right? Like if you've ever been driving on the freeway and they're doing road construction and they close down 2 of the lanes, all of a sudden you have this bottleneck where everything slows down. And this bottleneck in the cognitive system is thought to narrow the stream of processing, such that not everything can happen at once. Not everything can flow through the lanes unimpeded. So there have been several attempts at trying to break down various aspects of attention, ways in which attention happens, to try to respond to some of these questions. And so one such aspect of attention that has been studied is the concept of divided attention. And so divided attention means that you're paying attention to more than one simultaneous message at a time. So you're what we call multitasking, or at least attempting to. Anyway, as many of us can actually attest to, in most cases, our accuracy on one or both tasks decreases, especially if the tasks are challenging. So we might think that we're multitasking and being productive, but really we're being less productive than we would be if we had just focused on one task or the other. And so when divided attention is studied in the lab, researchers what they do to simulate this divided attention is they have participants perform two tasks at once. And so some of the original studies on this, people were asked to type a written message, yes, on a typewriter, because this was done in the 70s, and to also answer the phone at the same time. Also, there were some variations on this. So some participants were asked to type a written message. So they had maybe a message written out, right? And then they were typing it so that it looked more formal. And then they were answering the phone at the same time. Spelke, Hurst, and Neisser had their participants reading for really detailed comprehension, and then also taking down dictation at the same time. So they're giving a passage, and they had to really detailedly read it and try to understand what was being said while someone was talking to them and having them write down a message. And so, as you might expect, performance on these two simultaneous tasks was pretty poor, but at least at first. And so Spelke et al., what they had them do is they had their participants actually practice the tasks 5 times a week for 85 sessions. And so over time, the participants' performance actually gradually improved in the speed of their reading. It also improved in the level of comprehension that they had of what they were reading. And also, they increased the number of dictated words that they were able to accurately write down. And so eventually, their performance reached levels that participants had originally shown when they had performed each of the tasks on their own. And then Spelke was like, well, since they got used to that, let's up the challenge rating again. And so then they added another task. They also required that participants report the relationships among the words that were dictated. And so again, at first, participants really struggled with this and really noticed very few relationships. But with practice, they then began to notice that words were related in a variety of ways. So they were able to pick up on patterns such as, oh, these words belong to the same sort of category, or they rhymed, they formed, a sentence. They were similar parts of speech. So they were all strings of nouns or verbs or things like that. And so, of course, as you can imagine, the other tasks that researchers were having participants do decreased with the addition of this new task, but then also improved to former levels with practice. And so this research spurred a lot of subsequent studies. And of course, as you can guess, a lot of the studies today on divided attention have to do with driving. And so, for example, the researchers Levy, Paschler, and Bohr asked moderately experienced drivers to perform a simulated driving task. So they weren't teenagers who had just gotten their license, but people who had been driving for probably at least 5 to 10, if not more, years. And so each participant was in a driving simulator, and they were following a lead car that was shown on the screen in the simulator. And so one of the tasks was that they needed to brake when the car in front of them braked. And then the other task that they had to do was identify how many times a tone occurred. Did it occur once or twice? And so results showed that participants could brake much more quickly when they were not having to try to decide how many times a tone had occurred. But when both tasks had to be performed at the same time, the speed of their braking suffered. And so this research obviously has important implications for cell phone use in the car. Unfortunately, even though we have so many hands-free options now, and it's really just become the norm, right, to not hold your cell phone up to your ear while you're driving. But even though there's been this huge influx of hands-free technology, it doesn't mean that it's been cognitive processing free. And so research shows that we still make driving errors when we are talking on the phone or even listening to something, a podcast, for example. And this is in comparison to driving just without conversation or other distractions. As an example of this, Strayer and colleagues had participants drive, again in another driving simulator, where they had to follow a lead car and brake when that car braked. And when they were in simulated light traffic, the people who were in the cell phone group, again, using hands-free technology, but on the phone nonetheless, they took slightly longer to apply the brake. And then in heavy traffic conditions, they then took significantly longer than those in the control group. And so further testing showed that participants who also used their cell phones showed a form of inattentional blindness. So again, they were missing out on information in their environment, and their processing speed was also slowed as well. And so other studies that have been done by Wickman, Nieminen, and Sumala compared experienced drivers with novices. So again, they were comparing experienced drivers with like those who had just gotten their licenses recently. And so the participants in this study were required to drive and perform a variety of other tasks at the same time. Because it was the 90s, they were asked to change a cassette tape. They were asked to dial a cell phone, to change the radio to a certain station. And so the less experienced drivers divided their attention much more ineffectively than the experienced drivers did. So they often glanced away from the road for more than 3 seconds. And in addition, these novices often swung to the side of the road when they glanced away. So not only were they looking away from the road, but then they had difficulty keeping the car straight in the lane. Although the experienced drivers were a lot more efficient at looking away and a lot quicker, and still able to keep their cars didn't swing out, they stayed in the lane better. They still obviously took time to complete these tasks and still glanced away from the road. And so most accidents then appear to have been caused by a failure to divide our attention successfully. And this has been shown by a number of studies. One such study by Warner in 2004, they looked at 2,700 crashes that occurred in Virginia during June through November of 2002. So this was 2,700 crashes that occurred over a 5-month period. And so in order of top causes, we have rubbernecking or gawking, this kind of experience of, well, looking, maybe at other accidents or, what was going on with a police officer who pulled someone over, construction. Following this was driver fatigue, looking off at the scenery or landmarks, distractions that were caused by passengers, adjusting, whatever form of music, and then cell phone use. And on average, Warner found that 62% of the accidents were caused by distractions that happened inside of the vehicle. And 35% were caused by distractions that occurred outside the vehicle. And so overall, the majority of the accidents were caused by our inability to divide our attention efficiently and effectively enough in order to keep ourselves safe while driving. So another aspect of attention that has been studied is what is called selective attention. And so selective attention occurs when two or more messages are presented. And when the person tries to only attend to one of them while ignoring the others. And so the study of selective attention probably has a longer history than that of divided attention, although, again, divided and selective attention are both of interest to psychologists. And so one way that selective attention has been studied is through the Stroop effect. This effect is named for John Ridley Stroop, who first developed this task in 1935. And so in this, participants are asked to name the color of the ink that the names are printed in. So there's 3 different stages. The first stage is of the Stroop task is to name the colors. There are blocks of colors that participants see. So blue, red, green, red, blue, blue, red, green. And then next, they're asked to read words. So again, now it's printed blue, red, green, blue, blue, green, red, green, blue. And then lastly, the trial in which the Stroop effect appears is when participants then are asked to name the color of the ink that the word is printed in and not actually what the word says. So the word red, R-E-D, wow, might be printed in blue ink, or the word yellow is then printed in brown ink. And so compared to when the words are written in matching ink colors, or even just, in the process of naming the colors themselves or just reading off the words, participants find this task really difficult, mostly because the name of the word interferes with the name of the ink color. And so one explanation for why this happens is that there are 2 processes that are competing with each other. So there's the process of naming the ink color and reading the word. And both of these are automatic processes, but one is more automatic than the other. And so as a result, there's like I said, this competition that's going on here. Which output will get to the response system first? Will it be the name of the ink or what the word says? And so once the information gets there, there's a checking process that occurs. And so sometimes the result is a wrong response in which the information has to be reprocessed. And so this likely looks like someone going red, blue, catching themselves even though they've made a wrong response, but catching it and then reprocessing in order to give the correct answer. And there are actually a number of variations on this original Stroop task. This includes a number Stroop, a directional Stroop, animal Stroop, emotional Stroop. And the emotional Stroop is probably the most common version of this. And so in this, the original stimuli are replaced by words that describe emotions, and they're printed in different colored ink. And the results of this show that people respond more slowly when they have to name the ink colors if the words describe emotions versus if the words are neutral. They don't have any emotional content to them. So for example, participants would be slower to name ink color if the word was sad or angry or scared, than if the word was neutral, just like flower, freedom, table, those sorts of things. So some more research on selective attention has been done by a researcher named Colin Cherry. And he was interested in selective listening, which has come to be known as the cocktail party phenomenon, or the cocktail party effect. And so he was intrigued by people's ability to focus in on one message or signal in the midst of all this other sound that's happening at a cocktail party, for example, or any sort of group gathering. And so again, this is, you've probably had this experience where you're in a group of people, you're talking, and all of a sudden you pick up that somebody has said your name. You hadn't been listening to anything else that was going on in the other conversations, but suddenly you're aware that your name has been called. And so in order to try to study this, he's tried to set up an experimental situation that would somewhat duplicate these kinds of group gatherings and this sort of what came to be called the cocktail party phenomenon. And so he developed a task called a dichotic listening task. And so in a dichotic listening task, what participants have to do is they have two different messages that are being played in each ear. And so their job is to focus on or attend to only one of the messages. And so to make sure that they were in fact actually focusing their attention on the intended message, Colin Cherry asked them to shadow the message. So that is, they repeated the words of the message that they were focusing on as they heard it. So here in this image that we have on the slide, if they were attending to the green output, they would be saying out loud as they heard it, President Lincoln, often read by the light of the fire, while at the same time they do have the horses galloped across the field coming into their other ear, but they're trying not to pay attention to it. They're trying to focus on this input about President Lincoln. And so what did Cherry find? He found that subjects were able to shadow, that is to repeat the information accurately, as long as the messages differed in some way based on their characteristics. So like the pitch, so like how high or low the message was. Also volume was another aspect. And so, for example, if one of the messages was read by a male voice and the other by a female voice, then people didn't have any difficulties shadowing. So that is not only attending to the message, but repeating it aloud as it was said. However, if the messages differed only in their meaning and there was no other differentiating characteristic, then shadowing was a lot less accurate. And in addition, Cherry observed that the shadowing task wasn't easy based on the performance that he saw in his subjects. And so even though most people were pretty accurate, they generally shadowed or repeated these messages as they heard them in a more monotone kind of voice. So President Lincoln read by the fire, or whatever that was in the previous slide. And they also really found it difficult to report the gist or the overall meaning of the message after they said it. And so Cherry was also interested in the information that was coming in through the ear that participants weren't paying attention to. So what's going on with the material that's not being said aloud as it comes in, and the information that's supposedly being ignored by participants. And so in order to try to examine this, he altered the message in the unattended ear to see if they would notice it. So he would switch up certain aspects of the message. And subjects reported that they noticed when the voice in the unattended ear went from male to female and then back again. And they also noticed when the voice switched to tones. So rather than it being a voice, it was more just like melodic tones that were making a noise, and then it went back to a voice. However, they didn't report any differences when the meaning of the message changed, or when the language in which the message was spoken changed. And also, they couldn't recall a word. They couldn't recall anything from the unintended message. And so this was also confirmed by a researcher in 1959 by the name of Morey. Played back just the same set of words 35 times in the unattended ear, just, cat, 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 35 times in the unattended ear, while the other message was going on in the attended ear. And still, participants were totally unable to report any of the words that were supposedly coming into the unattended ear. So based on Cherry's work and other researchers' work, as well as his own, a cognitive researcher by the name of Donald Broadbent developed what's considered the first theory of attention. And this is called the sensory filter theory. And it's a type of stimulus selection theory. And so within Broadbent's theory, the idea was that all information comes into the processing system via the sensory stores. And it's held briefly here in the sensory stores. Again, and this is the sort of receptacle or holding area for the really basic parts of sensory experience. So maybe what a particular sound is, or maybe the location of something that you see. And then the assumption is that from the sensory store, it's then passed through a filter that selects information based on certain characteristics. So the filter is looking for certain sorts of characteristics that it would then prioritize in order to pass on through the filter, and then moving on to a more limited capacity channel. And so sensory filter theory provides an explanation for why so much information from the unattended ear in dichotic listening wasn't recalled. It wasn't getting through the sensory filter into the rest of the processing system. So the unattended information was going from sensory store, hitting the filter, and the filter was saying, nope, this isn't important enough for us to focus on. And so it wasn't going on through. However, this is an interesting theory, but there were some problems with it that actually arose eventually. And as researchers continued with their studies, they soon began to see data that was inconsistent with Broadbent's theory. More specifically, they showed that people were able to identify their own names when their names were put into the message played in the unattended ear. Also, people continued shadowing a message. So when it went from the attended ear to the unattended ear. So even though they were supposed to ignore it, they still ended up continuing to verbally follow it. And so it seems that people do process some aspects of the unattended message that they hear, and that this process seems to be meaning-based. So it wasn't that they were recalling instances where more meaningless stimuli were being involved, like cat, 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 over and over again, like in Maury's study. But when they heard information that had meaning to it, such as their name, or was a continuation of a message they had already focused on and assigned meaning to, then there was still some processing that was happening through the unattended ear. And so, like I said, this then brought up the question of, well, how does this filter then select information for meaning? This idea of the filter was kind of a nice stepping stone, but we needed to get more information about how it worked. And so, then we had Treisman, who modified Broadbent's concepts. And so because of this, her theory is still this sort of stimulus response theory. And so she said that instead of completely blocking out unattended information, that information had its volume turned down. So, so we would be able to attend to it, but it would be really difficult because it wasn't very loud, so to speak. And so here, Treisman argued that there are actually three kinds of analyses that we can perform on information that comes in from the environment. And so we can analyze information's physical characteristics. We can analyze the linguistics, and we can analyze the semantics, or the meaning. And so it sounds like the processing system analyzes information that's coming in just to the extent that it has to, in order to distinguish the attended information from the unattended information. So if, for example, then if the two types of information can be discriminated by sort of like, let's say, physical characteristic analysis, then that's as far as the analysis has to go. So these different levels of analyses sort of allow for this sort of streamlined approach, this efficiency to attention. But again, it was only to the extent that the distinction was able to take place, right? So it wasn't doing anything more sophisticated than that. It was just really doing the bare minimum to try to differentiate between these two messages. So as a result of findings that suggested that the meaning of a message affects whether we're processing incoming information, the Deutsches and also Norman developed another type of theory, and this is called response selection theory, or late selection theory. We'll talk about that in a moment. So essentially, this theory assumes that all information is processed to the point of identification or recognition, after which some sort of meaning-making mechanism determines whether the information should then receive further processing. And so this meaning-making mechanism, or pertinence mechanism, is tuned to certain topics, so that information regarding these topics then activates it. And so again, the theoretical idea of how this happens is that this pertinence mechanism then increases the baseline activation of relevant information. And then if this information is also activated by identification, then it's more easily transferred to working memory for further processing. So essentially, this pertinence mechanism essentially tags relevant information. And then if it then is tagged and is as identified, then it is singled out as like, okay, this should go on to working memory, right? All the signs point to this should go on to working memory for further processing. Now, contrary to the stimulus selection theories, response selection theories limit the number of responses that a person can make because of this selection process that's done by this pertinence mechanism. And so the problem, again, identified as researchers began to investigate this, is that we don't seem to be limited in the number of responses that we can make, at least from different channels. So we can have visual information and auditory information, olfactory information, right? Smells coming in. And we're not limited within each of those channels to make responses. Also, response selection theories, they also have some difficulty accounting for some of the earlier data that were collected. And so, again, as we see in science, one theory begets another theory. And so there are a number of different models of attention or ways of thinking about attention. And so according to researchers Schifrin and Schneider, attention it's more of a type of processing that happens, but with limited resources. And so specifically, the idea that there's this limited capacity processor in the system that then produces this bottleneck that we talked about in terms of processing. So there's this processor that can only process so much information at a time. And so then this leads to sort of this slowdown or this narrowing of information. And so the idea here is that there are then two types of processes that happen from this. So there's controlled processing, and then there is automatic processing. And so with controlled processing, these are the kinds of processes that require the use of a limited capacity processor, especially when it comes to working memory. And so this then has this domino effect, right, where it limits the amount of processing that can be done at any one time. So this means usually that tasks need to be completed, one after the other in some sort of serial step-by-step manner. Controlled processing is also relatively slow in comparison to automatic processing. And controlled processing, like its name suggests, is under conscious control. And controlled processing also allows for the permanent transfer of information to long-term memory. So these controlled processes have this intentionality behind it. And so automatic processes then, in contrast, were proposed to occur very rapidly, and they don't require any access to working memory. And so as a result, these processes, they don't interfere with other things that are going on in working memory. They can just do their thing in the background, what we call working in parallel with other processes. And they really appear to require little to no effort or intention behind them. And in addition, once these automatic processes have begun, like their names imply, they cannot be stopped or changed because they're not under conscious control. So once they're activated, they're going. And also, they don't lead to a permanent transfer of information to long-term memory. And so, this capacity theory explains how it's possible to perform more than one task at a time. And so, although we do have a fixed amount of attentional resources, we're able to spread those resources out among various tasks. And as long as the demand for those resources doesn't exceed our resources, then we can perform these multiple tasks. So again, more problems with these theories. Why we always revise. So one such critique of the idea of capacity is that this model, it seems to be oversimplified. So it's too broad. It's not specific enough to actually be helpful. Because people can divide their attention more easily when the simultaneous tasks are in different modalities. So for example, people can concentrate on writing and listening to music simultaneously, but it's a lot harder to write and listen to a podcast at the same time. And so the reason is that the latter two tasks are both verbal. And yes, even though, let's say listening to music, there are words involved, but you're not processing them in the same way that you are listening to conversations or listening to stories in the form that many podcasts take, while also writing, likely in a similar sort of maybe narrative fashion too. And with respect to the criticism of, well, it's too broad and vague, it's not clear that the theory is as testable as it sounds. It does provide a good complement or support to filter theories like broadbent. And so filter theories, they seem to be more compatible with data when there are competing tasks that are going on. So capacity theories seem to better explain the phenomena of divided attention on complex tasks, where there are practice effects that can be seen. Again, practicing the same task over and over, like we saw in Spelke. And as each of these complex tasks becomes increasingly more automatized or automated, then performance of each task then makes fewer demands on the limited capacity attentional resources that somebody has. So again, we can see this if you think back to when you started learning to drive, right? When you first started learning to drive, you felt like you had to attend to everything, and it was exhausting. Where the gas pedal and the brake pedal are, turn indicator, checking your mirrors, checking the speedometer, the radio volume, the cars going around you, and things like that. But as you had more and more practice with that, those complex tasks became a lot more automatic. Now, it's probably just a second nature now for you to check your mirrors right before you make a lane change. Whereas before you had to be like, okay, I need to get over. Okay, to get over, oh gosh, okay, how do I shift my attention briefly from looking at the road to looking in my side mirror and then back at the road? Whereas now you just do it without a second thought. So that's where we'll go ahead and end for today, and we'll pick it back up on Wednesday. I look forward to seeing you all then.